Yo. What up? It's Chris from Black Land Ownership. I hope you're doing well. And I wanted to share something that I'm working on. It's not a completed idea. This is not the final form of this research, investigation, inquiry. It's just the beginning of an ongoing conversation. It ties into Black land ownership. We want to encourage Black folks and people of African descent to own land, steward land, work with the land. I understand living in cities. I understand urbanization. I understand the benefits of being in very densely populated areas and the diversity that's available. But I also would encourage people of African descent to get into land ownership, not just home ownership, not just flipping houses, but land, space, acreage, where if you need to, you can grow food. If you want to, you can learn more about the natural environment and the world that we inhabit. It's very hard in a major city to learn about the variety of animals and wildlife that tend to be in a geographic region. It's hard to have access to clean water and clean air in some of these urban areas. And I think as a mental health issue, as a physical health issue, as a lifestyle opportunity issue, more Black folks can take advantage of or see the benefit of being in more natural spaces, being in open spaces, being in areas that aren't heavily and densely populated, and being in areas that allow us to connect, reconnect, be in touch with nature, be in tune with the world that exists, that's not manufactured by other humans, and being able to really appreciate, I think, the life experience when you are out in the woods, when you're able to hike, when you're able to camp, when you're able to work with your hands in the dirt, your feet in the dirt. There are people who studied the science of that, of like the microbes and the bacteria and things that are in the dirt are a benefit to our bodies, and that we're made to engage with the natural environment around us. So in thinking about Black land ownership, the first question is, well, how do you get to land ownership in America in the first place? And what is the history of land ownership in America? And in what way do we view the legitimacy of land ownership in America? Recently, I think at the Grammys, Billie Eilish won something and mentioned no one's illegal on stolen land. And a lot of people are upset saying, well, you go back to your mansion, that's on stolen land. And it brings up a question with Black land ownership. Well, is all land ownership in America illegitimate by definition because the land was stolen? A question I ask is, are Black people supposed to be renters our entire lives because of colonial Europeans? Is there a way for us to engage with land practices, land stewardship, land ownership, in a way that's healthy, that is supportive of community, that is non-exploitative, that looks at humanity as a connected member of a larger world? And in that case, we should be involved with it. Now, again, how ownership works in America, that's a question for legal scholars to work out. But I want to understand then, what's the responsibility if you are going to own land? What's the responsibility if you are going to engage with community? And that brings up then a consideration of the people here before the land was stolen, which immediately brings us into questions of what's happening with quote unquote migrants and the question of human migration. When you think about America and land ownership in America, any European descendant here, any African descendant here has to then talk about the relationship with the people that were here before modern Africans came or Europeans came. And then the notion of migration being limited based on country borderlines that were drawn by elected officials or people who stole power, but humans are affected by these borders, that's a major question to talk about. The idea that how much of Texas, how much of Arizona, New Mexico, Southern California, all these areas were Mexico. The U.S. takes that over. And as people now are affected by the government actions of the United States in Central and South America, you have other forms of migration, whether it's people seeking asylum and they're fleeing political turmoil or violence, whether it's people moving because we're going through a time period in America where we wanted to increase our population, like in the 20s or 30s, whether we're going through a time period of we only want the very highly intelligent, under quotes, and wealthy people from certain countries. There's always this question of how do we manage, quote unquote, our borders. And in modernity, like specifically under the most recent Trump administration, the notion that immigration is bad, that like foreigners hurt our country, is something echoed in Europe. And you're seeing a rise of nationalism in the sense of the only good people in the world are the people in our country currently, and the people who have the historic nationhood identity. The problem in America is the historic nation of identity isn't white folks, but white folks right now are saying America is a European nation, it's a Christian nation, it's an English-speaking nation, and we don't like anyone from anywhere else. That isn't at least two of those three things. So immigration is not a problem if you're French, if you're British, if you're white European, you speak English. Immigration might not be a problem if you're Eastern European, where you're white and you're from a nationalist area, but you may not speak English, but there's a history of Polish, Hungarian, what have you. But when you start getting into Africans, when you start getting into Southeast Asians, when you start getting into people from certain communities in Caribbean and Central and South America, there seems to be this vitriol that is immediately attached to it. That that somehow Americans are better than these groups of people and that we're harmed by immigration, which has now led to a political platform of just get rid of immigrants. We can have a horrible policy on everything else, but as long as we focus on getting rid of immigrants, then everyone's happy in America. Well, I'm not happy with that. And as a black person, it could be really easy to fall into the American trap of nationalism and say, well, as a black American, my four parents did A, B, or C. People come here illegally. They don't deserve the same rights that I do. And I don't agree with that. Like me individually, I think all humans deserve to be treated like humans, no matter what their paperwork looks like. I think the notion of citizenship and the notion of how boundaries and borders are managed and how human migration is facilitated or not could be done a lot better. It's not let everyone in or put kids in cages. There's a huge spectrum in between that we've done a horrible job sorting out. But for a lot of black folks, it's like, hey, that's not our issue. I'm like, if you are, what do they call it? ADOS, American descendant of slaves or something. It's easy to say, well, I don't have any attachment to the immigrant community. Me personally, my homies are Jamaican, my homies are Haitian, my homies are Panamanian, my homies are Guatemalan, my homies are Argentinian, are Brazilian, are, you can run through like how many different places I have friends and they're from there. Their families are from there. Some were their first or second generation here, but the culture is brought with them. So I respect and I think that the human fabric is amazing when it's woven by people from different places if we have opportunity to be around each other. And so for me as a black person, I do have a problem with what's happening in immigration. But I know there are a bunch of black folks who are like, yo, we have our own fights. And a bunch of these immigrant communities do not fight for black folks. And I'm not going to get into that argument. Instead, I was thinking, let's do a comparative analysis between the Fugitive Slave Act and modern status revocations. So there are a bunch of people that have come to America and they are legally allowed to be here, but they are not technically citizens yet. They have not been granted their full citizenship that can't be revoked, right? And it's made to seem in the news that either you're a citizen or you're illegal. Well, it looks like there are these 6 or 8 categories that are somewhere in between to where you are allowed to be here legally, but you are not a citizen yet. But what's happened is as those statuses get altered, changed, or the executive branch decides to review them or not, people who were here legally have their status removed and they are now under threat of deportation, fines, harassment, targeting from ICE or other groups. So it made me start thinking, like, what makes sense so that masked folks with no ID can round up people, put them in vans, and no one bats an eye? It reminds me of slave catchers. And more specifically, black folks who were in free areas. There's a movie called 12 Years a Slave, where a free black person was in an area, gets kidnapped, taken to a slave area, and returned to slavery. And he did nothing different. It wasn't like he violated the law. He did something to be a target. Just by being, and the law is changing, he then could be taken into captivity. And that's what's happening with folks here who are under temporary status, who have different forms of status removed, revoked, or disregarded, so that you have judges who have signed paperwork saying this person cannot be deported, and the government says yes they can, and someone gets paid to do it. So I'm doing a comparative analysis between Fugitive Slave Acts and modern status revocations and how it ties into money, it ties into executive power, and a number of things. So this is the breakdown. This is not a conclusive summary. This is just the beginning, and hopefully this is the beginning conversation. Executive summary. For comparative analysis, Fugitive Slave Acts and modern status revocations. Executive summary. This report examines parallels between antebellum Fugitive Slave Acts and 21st century U.S. policies that strip legal status from protected migrants. Both frameworks empower the state to transform people lawfully present into fugitives subject to removal, often irrespective of any wrongdoing by the individual. We're going to look at legal texts from 1793, 1850, acts versus modern Department of Homeland Security directives, non-citizen status categories, enforcement processes, economic beneficiaries, and rhetoric. The analysis reveals recurring patterns: centralized authority to revoke presence, punitive fines for third-party aid, and language dehumanizing people as fugitives or quote-unquote aliens. Major industries profit from enforcement: private prison firms, airlines, aviation contractors, surveillance technology vendors, echoing how 19th century markets, slaveholders, attorneys, law enforcement, benefited from slave catchers. In sum, both eras reflect how race and immigrant status becomes a basis for state power to revoke freedom, supported by economic and legal structures that treat human beings as commodities. The historical enforcement under Fugitive Slave Acts. The Fugitive Slave Acts of 1793 and 1850 obligated government officials and citizens to arrest and return enslaved persons who escaped to free states. For example, the 1793 Act empowered any slaveholder or agent to, quote, seize or arrest such fugitive from labor, end quote, and present them before a judge. Upon affidavit of escape and proof of ownership, the judge issued a certificate authorizing removal of the person to the state or territory from which he or she fled. Section 4 of the Act imposed heavy penalties on anyone who hindered a capture or harbored a fugitive, forbidding rescue efforts and imposing fines of $500, then a huge sum, for each offense. In practice, free black people lived under constant threat. Courts in free states routinely treated them as potential fugitives. Let me say that again. In practice, free black people lived under constant threat. Courts in free states routinely treated them like potential fugitives. A California court in 1852 infamously declared that nothing in the state's law prevented it, quote, from removing all or any one of these classes, free Negroes, fugitives, or slaves, from her borders, end quote. This rhetoric equated free black residents with fugitive slaves and affirmed their utter vulnerability under the law. So, with modern revocation of migrant status, in recent years, U.S. policy has similarly enabled the executive branch to rescind legal protections once granted. Under Presidents Trump and Biden, the Department of Homeland Security has issued termination notices or curtailments of statuses like temporary protected status, which is TPS, or deferred enforced departure, DED. For example, DHS, Department of Homeland Security, in January 2026 formally terminated Somalia's TPS designation effective March 17, 2026, because Somalia no longer meets the conditions. Similarly, DHS issued a notice terminating Haiti's TPS designation effective September 2nd, 2025. In February of 2025, DHS Secretary Kristi Noem even vacated an earlier extension of Haiti's TPS, shortening the protection period and forcing 260,000 Haitians out of status sooner. These actions stripped formerly lawfully present migrants of legal status, not for any misconduct of theirs, but because the secretary no longer found country conditions sufficient for continuing relief. Let's say this again. These actions stripped formerly lawfully present migrants of legal status, not for any misconduct of theirs, but because the secretary no longer found country conditions sufficient for continuing relief. Unlike citizens, the migrants that have TPS or they're asylum seekers, they have no guaranteed permanence. The law explicitly allows DHS or the president to terminate such programs by executive action. Thus, people granted refuge or relief are left legally present, then suddenly invalidated by government fiat, a dynamic reminiscent of slaveholders' revocation of freedom for fugitive slaves. Once status is ended, those individuals become vulnerable to arrest and deportation under immigration statuses, much as escaped slaves became fugitives once captured. All right, so in thinking about this, a lot of folks think it's either citizen or non-citizen. I'm going to go through the different non-citizen status pathways. So not that you didn't do anything, but you're not fully a citizen. And then the pathways that lead you to citizenship. So your status category, lawful permanent resident, LPR. Key rights and benefits: you can live, work indefinitely, some welfare, and there's a path to citizenship, right? Lawful permanent resident. Duration is indefinite until loss of your case or removal. Revocability can be revoked, terminated for criminal or fraud. Procedural protections: removal hearing in immigration court and appeal rights. So that's a lawful permanent resident. Then you have a naturalized citizen. Full citizenship rights. The duration is permanent. The revocability is rarely revoked, only for fraud in your naturalization process. and that would take a federal court proceeding for a denaturalization. So when you've heard the president threaten to remove people's citizenships who have they are full naturalized citizens, that would require a federal court proceeding. And usually the only reason that is revoked is if there was fraud in the naturalization process. Then you have non-immigrant visa holders, limited stay, e.g. F1 student, H1B worker, if authorized. Fixed term per visa, which is renewable, and visa can be revoked or expire. Status ends if conditions lapse. Removal proceedings if status is violated, e.g. overstay, and if you break laws. Then you have a asylee, a person who has been granted asylum. They have legal residence, work permit, and eventually lawful permanent resident eligibility. The duration is infinite, but must apply for the lawful permanent resident after 1 year. It can be revoked if asylum was fraudulently obtained, which is rare. And asylum hearing process is the way you do that, with a possible appeal to the BIA or federal courts. Then you have refugees who've been admitted. They have asylee rights and entry via special program. It's indefinite and must apply for long-term permanent resident after 1 year. And the same, it can be revoked if asylum was fraudulently obtained. And that process would be resettlement screening and asylum procedures. Then there's DACA, the deferred action, where you can have work authorization protected from deportation while deferred. It's temporary and renewable every 2 years. It can be revoked entirely at discretion of Department of Homeland Security and can be ended by policy change. It requires no formal hearing and termination policy. See Texas versus Biden. Then you have temporary protected status, where you have stay and work authorization for nationals of designated countries. The duration is temporary, a designated period with extensions. It can be terminated by Department of Homeland Security if country conditions improve. And you'll need a notice and comment Federal Register termination, no right to appeal beyond injunctions. You have deferred enforcement departure. Similar to TPS, where you are authorized to stay and work, it's temporary as long as administratively granted, and the president may end at any time. Designation not statutorily defined, and it requires no formal procedure, typically notice given and possibly challengeable in court. You have parolee or humanitarian in state. They are granted temporary permission to enter and remain for urgent reasons. There's a set period, often 1 to 2 years, which may be extended. That parole can be revoked by Department of Homeland Security and ends at a set date or by rescind. Parole is discretionary and challenged via individual petitions or federal suit. Then you have a U/T visa holder, where you have a work permit, stay for victims of crime and human trafficking. And the length of this is 4 years. That's renewable every 4 years. The status is lost if the conditions are violated, and you can apply for a long-term permanent resident after 3 years. Upon status removal proceedings, the person is typically barred and must apply separately for a long-term permanent resident. Then you have a pending asylum applicant. They have no formal status until approved and can apply for a work permit after 150 days. Indefinite in terms of how long you can do this, and if asylum is denied, they are subject to removal. That is done through immigration court hearings and appeals to BIA or federal courts. All right, so I just listed, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 different categories of being a quote unquote migrant here that are not permanent resident, right? Like naturalized citizen. So when you hear it on the news, it's as if either you're totally illegal and did no paperwork, or you're a naturalized citizen. There are 10 or 11 other categories that allow people to be in the country, but they will not have paperwork that say that they are citizens. So what does that lead to when it comes to what ICE is doing and some of these other organizations, rounding folks up and playing around with their statuses? You have to consider the economic interest and the industry beneficiaries. The enforcement and removal apparatus generates vast profits for private industry. Key sectors include private prison detention companies. Corporations like Core Civic and GEO Group operate many ICE detention centers. In 2025, the ICE budget surged, doubling bed capacity plans. Core Civic's second quarter 2025 revenue reached $538 million, up 10%. From the former year, and GEOs reached $636 million, up 5%. Both firms have signed new contracts to add tens of thousands of beds. For example, GEO reactivated 4 facilities at 6,600 beds, expected to yield over $240 million per year. A recent federal budget even included an unprecedented $45 billion budget for ICE expansion, for detention and removals, locking in windfalls for these firms. If you look at transportation and aviation contractors, airlines and charter firms profiting from deportations have seen massive growth. For instance, CSI Aviation, providing removal flights, saw ICE contract revenue jump from 238% after 2021. Let me say that again. Airlines and charter firms profiting from deportations have seen massive growth. For instance, CSI Aviation, providing removal flights, saw ICE contract revenue jump 238% after 2021, from $336.9 million to $1.23 billion. Daedalus Aviation, a DHS contractor, earned $140 million selling deportation planes in 1 year. Its executives also control a separate $1 billion DHS contract to manage voluntary departure flights. In short, specialized carriers now treat deportation operations as major business lines. When you look at surveillance or security firms, data analytics and security companies have lucrative contracts. Notably, Palantir Technologies won a $30 million ICE contract in 2026 to build an immigration OS platform to identify undocumented immigrants and track deportations. Palantir ICE revenue exploded, a 297% jump to $81.1 million by 2021. Other tech firms, e.g. facial recognition, biometric scanners, similarly profit from enforcement. These capitalists benefit from weaponized migration control, akin to how 19th century arms makers and slave traders profited from the fugitive slave regime. Law enforcement contractors. Beyond prisons, numerous contractors supply transportation in terms of buses, vans, medical services, and surveillance equipment to ICE. All these sectors see gains with any policy strengthening removals. For example, a 2025 report noted that DHS awarded CSI Aviation its largest ever contract after a political turnaround, illustrating how policy drives corporate profits. And I have a list of certain industries. So private detention, of course, civic, with the flights, with surveillance, you can look them up. Now, then we think about rhetoric and language parallels. We keep hearing about undocumented migrants, yet when I read you the number of statuses migrants can have, they are clearly documented. They had to register for these different categories to have the status. And a number of people who are being targeted are in the asylum process. They have been granted some type of ability to stay here because they were victims of human trafficking or violence. They're from a country that had enough instability that we created relationships, like with the Afghanis or with folks that came over following the Iraq War. Like, they're all here legally, but they do not have their citizenship yet. It doesn't mean they're totally undocumented. And so I wanted to look at rhetoric and legal language. So when you think of fugitive slave, what are you willing to do to a fugitive slave that you would not do to a brother, sister, or a homie? What are you willing to do to a migrant or an alien or an undocumented person that you won't do to a citizen? So language dehumanizing targeted groups recur in both eras. The 1793 Act repeatedly labels escapees as fugitive from labor or service, the freed slaves, making them objects of capture. Similarly, modern law and discourse often call undocumented migrants aliens or fugitives. ICE itself has a national fugitive operations program explicitly adopting the fugitive metaphor. In 2023, it fielded 129 fugitive operations teams nationwide. Advocates note that media and officials frequently use terms like illegal alien or undocumented to signal criminality and illegitimacy. By contrast, 1850 law forbade the escaped person even from testifying. In no trial or hearing under this act shall the testimony of such alleged fugitive be admitted in evidence. This silenced the enslaved person's voice, just as some modern policies make contesting removal orders extremely difficult. Official announcements also echo dehumanization. For example, a recent DHS notice tersely states Haitians and Somalis will no longer have TPS, abstracting thousands into a status category. And also saying that these countries are shitholes and all types of other stuff. Notably, 19th century law explicitly criminalized empathy. Section 4 of 1793 imposed a $500 fine on anyone who knowingly obstructed or hindered such claimant or rescued such fugitive. Modern analogs appear as well. Current immigration statuses levy criminal penalties on anyone assisting an unauthorized migrant, e.g., I guess U.S. Code 1324 prohibits harboring or helping illegal entrants and can even penalize provisions of aid. In both contexts, ordinary citizens were warned that helping the vulnerable would incur legal penalty. The rhetoric of the time shows parallels. Free blacks were often described as a sore on the body politic, while today's xenophobic narratives brand migrants as invaders or criminals. So, conclusion. When stripped of context, slave-catching laws and modern immigration enforcement share structural features. Their state power to revoke a person's freedom based on mutable legal statuses, the delegation of enforcement to police-like agents and private contractors, and the framing of the targeted individuals as inherently alien or criminal. As in the 19th century, today, people lawfully present at one moment can find themselves classified as fugitives the next. Let's say that again. As in the 19th century, today, people lawfully present at one moment can find themselves classified as fugitives the next, without any new wrongdoing on their part. Industries profit further entrenched the system, just as slaveholders and insurers gained when fugitive slaves were returned. Today, private prisons, airlines, and tech firms gain from immigration enforcement. Recognizing these parallels does not claim the situations are identical, but it illuminates how policies of removal recur within a larger pattern of state control over marginalized lives. All right, so for the black folks out there wondering why we need to care about what's happening with the migrants, this is my entry point. For the people out there that think it's okay what's happening to folks who've been dubbed illegal, I want to give a frame of reference. At a certain point, slavery was legal. The notion that all we have to do is say something is legal or not, or people are in violation of the law and we can dehumanize them or treat them like animals, that never sits right with me. So when we say all these people here and the migrants are bad, is bothersome to me. Like the starting point in America and Europe of them saying there's too much migration, there's too much people blending. Our cultures are going to be ruined by that expansion. Well, they were colonial powers. They expanded out into the world, but now they don't want anyone else to expand. Interesting. The notion of using language that dehumanizes people, I'm not for it. And I want people to recognize just because the law can do something does not make it right. Segregation was legal. Slavery was legal. Jim Crow laws were legal. The way people traveling from other countries, from other places who cross borders and don't have all their paperwork finished does not mean they should be treated like animals. And so I wanted to present this as a source of information. If you have any questions or you think I am not correct, I'd love to hear from you. If you'd like to add on, I'd love to hear from you. And I'm going to put this up on my YouTube once I download this. And yeah. All right. So y'all be safe.